Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another Feeling Thursday Battle Lounge with the 2MK team. There's one. It is again a King of Fighters 15 day. I keep forgetting just how many they'll let you to have.
Select order. Select stage.
Today we're all picking strong point characters. Or at least the strongest ones we can get for playing normal
Nothing will stop this show.
point character style play. Technically I should have put Geese first, but Miri and Geese do decently together. And I could therefore interchange as I needed to.
Are you ready?
This is our NA lounge and therefore you can join it very easily if you are anywhere in the eastern US or anywhere near enough to the Atlantic Ocean that you figure you might have actually good connection to us, which is quite a lot of people. One of the important things to getting, let's call it, better at this game is increasing your damage precisely because it is a very neutral heavy game to begin with. But the longer you can avoid having complexity in that space by either quickly deleting your opponent's health or shifting around things by putting them in positions you want them to be in, the easier your life will generally be. Most of the time people will play from relatively further away, but once they've got enough meter, you should usually expect to see a little bit of quick approach, quick death sort of scenarios. And this is particularly true if you expect anyone to make any errors that will allow you to get a big punish. Knowing exactly which of your buttons does that, therefore, is not only super important, but even if you've managed to get a decent punish, sometimes you just really want to keep the situation going and you're like me sitting on a certain amount of meter.
Round 3. Ready? Go!
Now because it's so relatively easy because of this game's pushback to keep yourself out of bad situations, you won't necessarily find a ton of people with this, let's call it, problem. But occasionally you will hit something you didn't mean to hit, or your opponent will, and the situation will become better for whoever didn't. With the strength of and range of most sweep attacks in this game, you can build up even more specific situations where you stay in control of a matchup because you've gotten a knockdown, and even though the knockdown itself isn't leading to what we would call, okay, there's usually not as good a pressure situation off of a sweep, you do have to worry about certain aspects of it regardless. People who know particularly good forms of that can be really distracting in terms of the way that they'll play the round.
Select order.
Miri normally goes straight through Geese's stuff, so we're gonna not do that quite that way right now. Sorry, straight through Joe's stuff.
It's about to be a party up in here.
So we'll do this the other way and save Mary for second in case Geese doesn't manage. A character's EX moves are usually a way to let you know whether or not the game's design, whether intentional, like specifically built this way or not, make them suited for being in a point or anchor position. Geese is fairly good at this because Geese doesn't really need Meteor to do anything. He can increase his damage quite a bit by having it, but you're not usually, like, overwhelmed if you don't have it. You have to have a good read on your opponent, more so than anything else. But in order to do this, you must control neutral to a point, and that brings us back to here. Because characters can quite quickly lose their health, sometimes that's the better strategy for the thing you're doing. Just end it as quickly as possible with whatever meter you've got, rather than have to deal with any of the extra neutral, particularly if you're not great at it with the character in question. Even that is a slight improvement, but I could have not necessarily finished the match there, but I could have definitely gotten more than I did, because that does in fact go straight into her super. And therefore, I ended up playing a whole match that I didn't need to play, because I didn't use the meter for the kill situation or the massive increase in effectiveness. My opponent is now much lower on meter, but I'm back to the same problem. This game is generally built quite heavily around that concept that you're just going to resolve your problem by using the meter. When you have characters like Shermie who are more effective from multiple ranges, the situation's improved, but it's not still basically not a good idea for you to not use the meter to get the kill whenever you can.
Final round. Ready? Go! Show no mercy.
In fact, I'm basically here being poked to death simply because I didn't hit something earlier. And because some of Shermie's supers are harder to do. But the ability to poke and keep some advantage in neutral is often about just poking enough to make sure your opponent doesn't do that to you. And as you meet players of higher and higher skill levels, you'll end up facing people who can get that level of confirm off of even small mistakes and you throwing out really big attacks.
Select members.
All set.
Select order. Select stage.
Now this isn't an uncommon thing for games in general. Figure out how to win in neutral, and then do a big set of damage from that. The main thing that KOF doesn't grant you normally is a way to convert neutral straight into that. Some characters have a good wake-up pressure in that way, but even when they do, it often doesn't let you go to big damage right off. You often need at least one EX move. Strong players will have a whole chain of EX moves.
Round one. Ready?
But it means that this moment where you're playing the point characters only, you don't really have that much going on. And technically, this is unfortunately one of the games where if you don't like randomness as a core concept, you're going to spend a lot of time hitting sweep in neutral. Because the opponent's perspective is going to usually be, I'm going to hit here, stand here and hit buttons to defend. But because sweep doesn't push you back far enough in other games, it's not a thing most people are used to doing. People who play very defensively in this game have to get constantly used to the idea that they're just going to get sweep hit on them over and over again, because they won't necessarily be in a position to punish it, particularly when they're just dealing with point characters, because even if they have a punish for the sweep, it's often an ES move. This matchup, for example, doesn't have to be played like this, but because I know that the way my opponent attacks is usually going to be waiting for me to make a move and then hitting, I have no reason to not just walk up to them and hit sweep every time. As long as I'm the one coming, there's going to be that style of attack going on. See? But at this point, I'm not really worried about this because it's the same thing. The thing I'm actually playing here is a different game altogether. I'm not trying to play neutral. I'm just controlling the meter because I'm aware of how the opponent's flow will be. Some people do this with pressure, and some people just do this in neutral.
Ready? Go!
But that isn't to say that this isn't actually a proper way to play the game. It is quite largely that. The issue is that these buttons that are being hit often have lots of gaps in terms of where they on the screen they can hit safely, which causes big problems. Wrong one, again. I practiced this for hours yesterday. Wrong one. But that's another good indicator, like, that happened because I hit the wrong counter, but not because countering itself was a bad idea. If you stress your opponent enough, the general way that you will get a response can be controlled up to a point in most games, but it comes up a lot more in King of Fighters. In fact, you can explicitly expect to spend a very large amount of time doing this in this game.
Select members.
And as your execution improves, there are become more and more ways to do it. Perfect hops, air to airs followed by hops, understanding buttons and timings better, something that our newest bots, while they're not necessarily all that effective in themselves, are trying to give.
Select stage. It's about to be a party up in here!
When you're facing characters that you do have a way to get close to, or players who are more likely to keep control by standing their ground but also therefore using riskier moves, you'll often have to have better punishes ready. But on your point character, you have to decide, is it worth it to your effort to deal with the characters themselves that way? For example, baiting that would lead to proper damage. But of course, I'd have to do it every time, and I'd have to decide, am I using meter to get more damage on this, or do I need my meter for later? The point at which you stop thinking about, does my point character need to leave meter for another, is usually at the point where you've entered the quote-unquote bad matchup, or when you don't think you can get the kill because your health is too low. So at this point, I should either decide, okay, I'm either definitely not doing it because I can't get the kill, or I'm committing to it hard because I can. Notice I have just enough for one more thing. You can even get to the point where you start to measure whether or not something is a good idea, since you're playing relatively long neutral anyway a lot of the time, by how much meter you have versus how much health your opponent has.
Ready? Go!
Because one bar of meter doesn't help me here, but another does. So I shouldn't necessarily do that much unless I think I'm going to get something out of it. But from there, I had 3 EX moves worth, which is just enough to kill on most characters if you know the right combo. So had I blocked that uppercut, it was possible. Geese, on the other hand, doesn't benefit as much from having this. I would have to get to 3, I think, for it to be really dangerous. And even then, I'd still have to do the move right. So in multiple situations, I'd find myself thinking, if it's Geese I lose, since Geese can do a lot of stuff with nearly no meter, it's not as bad. I can then carry forward with that meter
Select members.
and proceed from there. Normally we drop off after 3 wins, but since both of those, in my case, were against a particular opponent, I'm not doing that right away.
All set.
Select order. Select stage. Get ready for a battle of titans.
This situation, for example, is exactly the opposite of what you might want normally. But because Geese is better suited for dealing with Kukri in a neutral situation, the fact that Mary doesn't necessarily have enough meter to deal with Joe by damage isn't as big a deal because Mary can deal with Joe by just like fighting style. See? For example, my opponent basically immediately went to max full screen. You get a lot of freedom in therefore what you do here, and therefore how much meter you build up. But I shouldn't necessarily use that meter on Kukri unless I see a really good opportunity for it. I might just still end up playing this long drawn-out neutral game that I don't necessarily even want to play. And she has a lot of moves that are basically this. You just hit things and get punished basically instantly. Fortunately, Kukri is kind of easy to throw around in a specific position and timing, because the way he wants to attack leads to that. You'll notice my opponent, for example, is spending a lot of their time just mashing and running around. And while I couldn't get what I was probably aiming for the kill, I now have Geese who has a ton of meter, and a character who Geese can really hurt with just one super. Will I land it? Who knows? But the point is that it's not hard. He can do a lot from here with it. This forces my opponent to be on the offensive more, but being on the offensive against Geese is what I want people to be doing, so it's easier as a whole. So I managed to get through that while not using much of the meter at all, meaning I still have the same option for the big hit kill that Geese can always do. And she falls a lot for the simply, I'm going to fake you out and not actually use the thing. I always forget when that ends though. Unfortunately for me, I don't know what's up with my execution today, but no super. So here we are. have been bot training, and I'm probably going to do a lot more bot training, but nothing today. Shermie is less suited for the thing I'm trying to do, but this is mostly because, again, supers are harder. Because of the way that moves in this game interact, the amount of time you do spend poking around in neutral if you don't have really good confirms can be really problematic.
Select members.
Going around.
Select order.
The general speed of most moves and the large amount of options people have for movement stack on top of that. In many other games, you don't think that your opponent has so many options from a given space. Not at that speed. They'll look at a situation and go, I have 2 options, maybe 3 options, 4, but one of them is bad. In this game, they're usually at 5 or 6, and while 3 of them are bad instead of 1 of them being bad, you still have to be ready for 3 quote-unquote bad options, which is kind of a problem.
Round 1. Ready? Go!
But this movement heavy neutral doesn't mean that you don't have anything you can do to build up actual offense or effectiveness. It's that you have to understand that thing A, the aim of the game is generally to put your opponent where you expect them to be. And for this, you have the blowback attack, which helps a lot because for many characters it's quite powerful. Not every character will actually have a powerful enough blowback attack to cause the opponent stress, but point characters tend to. And I hit the wrong one again. I'm never going to get used to this. Well, no, eventually I'll get used to this. Another useful point of hard-hitting point characters is that if they can get through the middle character where their matchup is bad, it doesn't matter that they have no meter going to the next. What matters is that your opponent has a lot. But this is an optimal situation. My opponent has now used a lot of meter to kill a character that was already low on health. I expect it was probably just a error in execution, but the point is, you now have a structure to go from. And now, I'm straight back to having 2 meter on Mary. who can just use that as long as I don't mess up too much. Ooh. Perfectly done. She's good at maintaining it too. And I don't think Antonov would have actually died from Miri Typhoon there, so there wasn't much point in hoping for that. Shermie's a bit better suited for the problem though. What she lacks is a good enough blowback attack. Not what I was expected to happen there. You'll spend a lot of time at the beginning of this game thinking about this move should be used in this situation, but your timing being off. Because the opponent has so many approaches, they're not thinking as much about time that they are going to spend or lose out on. The approaches remain available whether or not they do anything with them in that moment. Alright then, after this one, if I win, I go off. We were not going to stream today as it's very hot, but as we are also working on the bots that are related to this, I figured I would have something to say. There's even a possibility that we will get one of them out tomorrow.
Select order. Select stage.
If you're not sure what I'm talking about when it comes to approaches, let's just review the number of ways that Athena can attack you without having to think about changing her spacing at all. Surely you can react to many things she does, but are you ready to react to them? And the more of them there are, the harder it is to be ready. In most games we think, okay, opening gambit. Here I don't know. She might go into the air, she might block. She might do nothing whatsoever. And because so many other approaches can be relatively easily defeated in other ways, you don't necessarily get to mess around that way. In fact, many of the better players spend their time almost entirely trying to get their opponent to think they're coming in and not really doing it. But if you do that, then you must learn the skill of getting to a position where your opponent's response is wrong, but you still have your own hit lined up for the next position. Geese actually has a lot of moves for this purpose, but I don't use them generally because they don't work well on the random standard populace, so I gotta be careful about learning to use them too much because of fighting teammates who will block in specific situations. Add to all that the fact that you can just roll out of people's pressure or their attacks if you chose not to respond, and now everything's gotten 3 times as complicated.
Are you ready?
Round 3. Ready?
That's why you'll see so much of the just hop into damage game from people. Hop into damage is a fairly clear return on investment. Either your opponent did something or they didn't. Now you're close up. You don't have to worry about all these different responses and attacks and vectors that could be used. Why do I get that this time and I didn't even try? Mary is even worse, as she just approaches from anywhere she wants at basically any time. Sure, you can learn which one is going to happen, but you can't decide whether or not she actually cares. And she can use half of them as responses, so you don't even feel like you get to play neutral. But this isn't actually all that strange. The main thing that makes it strange is the long range she has for a game that has otherwise such relatively short regular buttons. Perfectly done. Add to that, some characters have full screen command grabs, and others have basically instant command grabs. But here we go to break time. I think that works. Yes.
Select members.
The streams tends to get a little weird around now, most of the time, but maybe it'll be better today.
Select order. Select stage. Get ready for a battle of titans! Round one. Ready? Go!
Unfortunately, all of our work out in the wild, as we would say, has led to two conclusions about all this. The first is that once you've learned to defend against the hop game, technically it means that jumping becomes stronger against you, but not that much stronger, because it's harder to get good damage from it. And the whole thing devolves into this style of neutral, except that you as the player don't always have the same options for hops if your opponent is using them a lot. You don't necessarily have to say that King of Fighters is built around the hop offense. It's just one of the stronger ways to get into position for closer range play if you don't feel like going through the stress of trying to make every decision very quickly.
Burn to fight. Ready? Go!
But it is really obvious after you've watched high-level players for long enough that the waiting for people to make mistakes is still there, but they have to force them a lot more often. If you're used to games where playing full neutral is really rewarding but not necessarily all that heavy on the outcome, you'll fit right in if you start to play this one for any length of time. But what might be unintuitive is the number of ways that someone can do things that don't seem like they're necessarily good ideas to start, but will still put some stress on you. But this is how the game has been all this time, so if you're a King of Fighters player, or even just used to like the game a lot, you're probably quite familiar with this already. Even if you mostly played against the CPU or played in the arcade, the experience was very much the same. This is one of those games where the player versus player experience versus CPU experience are not very different, with the main difference being how much it reads your inputs, and it doesn't necessarily even do that very much, compared to other games, that is. This is partially related to its frame data, but overall it's the same idea. You'll notice there's a relatively large gap between what you might expect from other games in terms of how well you can punish things, and this one. Landing a proper punish is often a matter of walking forward very slightly when you know that your opponent's move has left them really vulnerable. Which makes sense because there are not too many moves in this game where you surge forward and use that as a big combo starter. At least not without once again using meter. It explicitly has close moves that do damage in different ways. And in some cases you have to get close enough for those moves to hit. At the moment that's what our Kyo bot is actually being based on. Kyo's moves, particularly supers, and the weird requirements of close hit range things for various characters is a good way to get experienced with this. And so far, thankfully, our Kyo bot is fairly easy to input. It's also not finished because it only actually took 3 inputs to use. But in general, it's another punish bot. But it allows you to see gaps and also to understand the difference between I now have an option because my spacing was good, and I don't have an option because my spacing was off. Which is one of the most critical things in this game, I'd say. There are explicitly spots against the Kyobot where certain characters don't get their close normal 100% of the time without taking at least one step forward. But they have enough time to take one step forward and it still be a punish. A thing that you can downright test using the bot. It will come up on the side of the screen that you got a punish, even though you did hold forward for just long enough to actually take a step.
Select order. Select stage. Get ready for a battle of titans! Round one. Ready? Go!
Once you do get to the point where your opponent can be hit by the hop though, it's a decent reward for building up a lot of meter, in short. We've talked before about how different matchup strategies allow you to just use the meter as you get it as a relatively clear way of winning the matchup, or at least forcing the opponent to use their own meter just as quickly. But not every matchup is like that. In fact, the majority of matchups in this game are not. So having the right punish ready at the right time is often a really big deal. And of course, those are the things they expect you to practice. You get slowly better at the game by not necessarily playing neutral differently, as most people who have experience with this game will have picked up the neutral skills long ago. Even just coming from other games, all you really have to adapt to is the fact that there are so many approaches, that you must deal with so many ways that your opponent could suddenly come at you. No one has to walk forward and wiggle, really. No one has to explicitly try to bait you with buttons. They can just come at you pretty hard from wherever, and it won't necessarily put them in that much danger either, especially when they don't have meter yet. If the target has no meter, you're generally pretty safe trying to get in, and they will try different things to stop you. Even the jumps in the game as a whole feel a little faster than you might see in other games of this type. Even the quote-unquote anime games, the jumps are usually pretty slow. It's just that you can change your direction or do moves in the air, but that's a thing that happens after you're up there. Recognizing a jump in this game, whether or not it's a hop, whether or not it's with a button that tends to win against your anti-air, whether or not it was a hyper hop or legit in the first place, this is a massive amount of mental stress, and you're generally better off either just blocking it, or if your opponent just hops all the time, just quickly train your hop defense. Which our Yoribot, if input correctly, will help you do long enough that you can generally get away with stuff. Because neutral is generally unrewarding by many standards, you can definitely see why it would be to someone's advantage, why they would think to try for the hop offense as quickly as possible. So that's just part of how the game is supposed to work. But understanding beyond that, that if your opponent tries for the hop and gets stopped, a scramble has happened that is now fair game for a lot of different things. Like this. And similarly, sometimes supers and so on do surprisingly little damage. They're not terribly different in feeling from EX moves a lot of the time. Never have been, really. They look cool and they have definite special properties, but a lot of the time you're just thinking to yourself, yeah, that hurt, but it didn't really hurt. you need more meter to do it. And that makes sense because the range and speed at which you build up meter in this game, it's just the equivalent of an EX move almost. You get to use half of it for that. This doesn't necessarily mean that defending as a whole is a great plan, because your opponent is closer to you while they have more options, so do you. And allowing them to just use those options without challenging with any of your own isn't usually the main plan you'd want to go with. Sure, you can wait until you are put at the right range, but a diligent opponent will probably have worked out the number of different ways that they could cause this to happen.
Select members.
All set.
Select order. Before you arrive. Select stage. Get ready for a battle of titans.
It is part of the reason why Geese as a character who seems to be like super strong isn't necessarily as devastating. Being able to counter anything only really helps you if your opponent can't use just about anything. Yashiro's probably one of the places where I'm more willing to rely on Geese as point, because Yashiro's lows aren't sudden. I don't have to worry as much about it. The thing I have to worry about in Yashiro's case is the attack happening at all. Ah, there's our flickery. We got all the way to minute 52, I think, today. So one of the main things that's happening, and that you have to get used to as an idea, on why I'm going to have to hit the blow back button a lot lately, is because your opponent can just respond to a bunch of things to happen anyway. They don't even care. Even if I were to throw Rapukins, I have to have convinced my opponent to stand still long enough to begin with. Otherwise they will just jump them. Even if I use the light one, that goes out quickly. It's very jumpable. Functionally on reaction. In fact, the main point of this move is not to keep your opponent out, but to stop them from coming in. Like, there's a difference between, I think I want you to get over here, or rather, I think you want to get over here, so I'm throwing this, and you are over there, so I'm throwing this. The speed of the game generally means that you don't get to choose to attack people where they are as often.
Burn to fight. Ready, go. Player 2 wins.
See you.
Ready, burn to fight. Ready, go. Gaijin-ken. Gaijin-ken. Yoko Isen. Yoko Kazuma Sanbangeri. Go for broke. Gaijin-ken.
Slicer. Speedball.
Gaijin-ken.
Slicer.
Similarly there, there's a bunch of stuff that's happening only because I know my opponent wants to get there, and not because it actually just works. But now I'm facing an Antonov with more meter than he probably knows what to do with. But I don't think the stutter is going to be the real reason this works out or doesn't. This one is actually about baiting in neutral. But there are so many things here that are just straight reactable that you'd be surprised. Even when you can't see too much and the stutter is a problem, you're still pretty reactable. Like that. See, I was thinking about baiting it, but then I realized my opponent has so much meter, that's not really what I want to do. Because Iori needs a little bit of help here. Gotta be careful with that kick. And you'll notice that I basically did the same thing. I had a lot of meter. I saw an opening for hop offense and just went straight for it without thinking too hard, because that's the payoff I'm supposed to get. But with the room rapidly destabilizing as usual, I'm wondering whether or not my opponent can even fight. Nope. It's one of those days. That usually means that the entire thing is about to collapse. And technically that therefore we've come to the end of a stream, though the lounge usually stays open. Oh no, she fell out. Then this is our last on-stream match of the night, I believe. Once we reach this point, it's a little bit problematic because you can't be sure that you'll be able to stay stable enough to even get your turn, which is why our KOF lounges sometimes end a little early. Once our bots are available,
It's about to be a party up in here.
we should be having some form of content tomorrow, but it's possible that we simply won't be ready, in which case you'll have to wait another week. It is Evo weekend, and therefore fighting gamers have a lot to watch and look out for, including us. And I think we might in fact just go with not doing that because one, it is hot, and two, we don't generally release things on Evo weekend. This match gets so neutral heavy sometimes. It's generally fun, but understanding exactly what's happening at any given time can be really hard. Wrong one. I deserve that for that. Just a little time with Kyobot is making me think a lot differently about this matchup, but that's just the standard thing you get from having a lot of experience in a specific situation. Nothing matchup related per se. It's just I can see the moves now and what they're for, and therefore it matters more. that one I'm still working into the bot itself. Since King of Fighters tends to have stricter execution for a lot of things, you have to be careful about that. Even throws can be harder to do. That, for example, was somewhat a given, simply because we went from two characters where Kyo has advantage using blowback, because Mary has to do a lot more setup to stop it, to a character that basically doesn't have to do any work, who just hovers outside of the blowback range and counterattacks anyway. But this black screen is probably not an indication that this fight is over, but the stream probably is. I might get booted, I don't know. You can find all of our bots at 2-mk.org. As I just noted, you probably shouldn't be looking out for this guidance tomorrow, but we will be working hard on our Kyo and Angel bots for next week. So enjoy EVO weekend. If we do decide to have any streams of our own this weekend, which is also up in the air, you will find the information for that on our Twitter 2_MK_FGC at the usual 7:30 Central European and Eastern times. If you don't see them by a particular time, assume that there's no stream. But Lounge might still be up, so you can take a look and see if you see any familiar names around. Hello, Robert. I just practiced it. It's a kick for geese. It's messing with my throws too, but probably not too much.
Burn to fight. Ready? Go! Double Rakugan! Double Rakugan! Player 2 wins! See you next time!
Obviously, I'm just going to end the stream as soon as this is over. But I honestly wasn't expecting it to kick back in either. This has been Rillian for Team 2MK. Good luck with your training and good night, everyone.